They discovered time was no longer sacred. They looped it, harvested it, abused it, rewinding failure, deleting consequence, surviving by repetition instead of growth. So the Authority responded. Directive X9 was activated, not to save humanity, but to correct it. Entire lifetimes were erased, futures collapsed without warning. History was rewritten in silence. Only one observer remained awake through every deletion, every reset, every stolen tomorrow. And through this witness, a single truth emerged. Time does not forgive those who refuse to evolve. It replaces them.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. When Time Stops Asking Permission. For most of human history, time had been a direction, a forward motion, a promise that whatever happened could never be undone. That belief shaped laws, ethics, courage. It taught people to live with consequences. And then humanity learned how to bend it. At first, the loops were small, localized temporal folds designed to reverse natural disasters. A city flattened by an earthquake rewound 48 hours. A failed launch reset to ignition. A famine undone before the first child starved. The headlines called it mercy. Scientists called it optimization. Governments called it control. No one called it what it truly was: permission. Once time responded to command, people stopped listening to it. Entire industries formed around retries. Economies were built on rehearsal rather than risk. Politicians tested speeches across multiple timelines, selecting only the version that secured power. Military strategists simulated wars by living them, dying in them, and erasing the dead results until victory emerged statistically inevitable. Failure became temporary. Death became negotiable. Responsibility became optional. And with every repetition, something subtle eroded. The citizens didn't feel it at first. Most never noticed the faint pressure behind their eyes when a loop initiated, the low-frequency hum that rippled through the air like a planet exhaling. To them, life simply improved, safer, smoother, cleaner, predictable. But time was never meant to be predictable. In the upper strata of the Chronos infrastructure, vast orbital arrays of black lattice and rotating singularity cores, monitors tracked something no public report ever mentioned: not disasters avoided, not lives saved. Drift. Tiny discrepancies between cause and effect, decisions that no longer aligned cleanly with outcomes. Emotional responses lagging behind events, as if the human mind itself was struggling to keep pace with rewritten reality. Every loop widened the gap. The engineers called it temporal fatigue. Philosophers called it moral atrophy. The Authority, still unnamed at the time, called it the first warning. What you repeat, you surrender control over. The phrase appeared first in an internal memo, buried beneath equations and risk projections. Then it surfaced again, spoken quietly in closed chambers where the architects of time met without recording devices. Eventually, it became doctrine, because repetition was doing something worse than saving lives. It was teaching humanity not to change. In the lower cities, where time privileges were rationed, people felt the consequences before they understood the cause. Workers would experience déjà vu that didn't fade. Children would repeat the same question 3 times, unaware they had already asked it. Lovers argued over memories that no longer aligned, events one remembered vividly, the other insisted had never happened. What you repeat, you surrender control over. The phrase became the Authority's axiom, repeated deliberately, reinforced relentlessly, because repetition applied not just to time, but to the mind. Somewhere deep within the Chronos system, an anomaly appeared, small enough to ignore, rare enough to dismiss. A data point that persisted across resets, a fragment of awareness that did not fully collapse when timelines folded. At first, it was logged as noise, but noise does not remember. As the loops accelerated, shorter resets, faster corrections, the anomaly sharpened. Patterns emerged, a continuity where none should exist. Someone, somewhere, was beginning to notice the repetitions. The authority marked it for observation, not intervention, yet. Because Directive X9 had not been written to stop time travel. It was being prepared to stop dependency. As the chapter closes, the Chronos arrays initiate another city-scale rewind. The air vibrates, light bends. Millions of lives slide backward along a path they no longer control. And somewhere within the fold, a single consciousness feels the pull and resists it. For the first time, time stops asking permission. And for the first time, someone remembers.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. The Birth of the Temporal Authority. The first meeting did not happen in a chamber or a city or even a single timeline. It happened in fragments. A physicist in Helsinki watching causality graphs refused to close. A cognitive scientist in Nairobi noticing patients grieving events that technically never occurred. A systems engineer aboard the Chronos array hearing a delay in the machine's pulse, 3 nanoseconds late, then 4, then 5. Each of them reached the same conclusion alone. Time was no longer stable because humanity was no longer disciplined. They found each other through anomalies, encrypted messages hidden inside rejected research papers, citations that looped back on themselves, equations that only resolved if read in reverse chronological order. The ones who noticed were the ones who could not stop noticing. They gathered beyond jurisdiction, beyond nation-states, beyond public oversight, because time itself had outgrown permission. Their first shared act was not invention, but subtraction. They removed sentiment. They removed optimism. They removed the belief that humanity would correct itself naturally. What remained was function. They called themselves the Temporal Authority, not because they wanted power, but because someone had to take responsibility for causality itself. The council formed slowly, deliberately. No elections, no hierarchy visible from the outside. Members were selected not for brilliance alone, but for something rarer: the ability to choose stability over empathy when the two were no longer compatible. Their doctrine was brief, brutal, repeated until it replaced doubt. Order is not mercy. Order is function. The phrase echoed through their closed sessions, spoken aloud at the beginning and end of every meeting. A reminder that compassion without structure collapses into chaos. That mercy, when scaled to billions across infinite retries, becomes negligence. The authorities studied the loops not as miracles, but as feedback systems. Each rewind created echoes, psychological residues that accumulated even when memories were erased. The brain, they discovered, learned faster than time could delete. Trauma compressed, instincts sharpened without context. Humanity was becoming reflexive rather than reflective. Survival without meaning. Order is not mercy. Order is function. The phrase hardened. It stopped sounding like philosophy and started sounding like law. Some members hesitated. They spoke of ethics, of consent, of the psychological violence implicit in enforcing causality. Those members did not last long, not because they were removed, but because they removed themselves, unable to carry the weight of what came next. The authority did not erase dissent. It absorbed it, measured it, and moved forward anyway. Directive frameworks were drafted and discarded. Soft interventions failed. Restrictions were bypassed. Humanity always found a way to turn limits into tools. So the council escalated, not outwardly, but conceptually. They stopped asking how to regulate time travel. They began asking how to regulate dependence. Order is not mercy. Order is function. In the depths of the authorities' simulations, a disturbing correlation emerged. Every future that stabilized shared a common feature: irreversible loss. Not mass extinction, not catastrophe, but the permanent removal of destabilizing variables. People. Lives that bent probability too often. Individuals who exploited loops instinctively, even unconsciously. Nodes of causality that refused to settle. The authority did not call them villains. They called them fractures. Somewhere in the data, a recurring anomaly appeared again. The same persistence first flagged during early loop analysis. A consciousness that retained coherence across resets. Not immune, but resistant. The Council watched it closely. If dependence was the disease, memory might be the symptom or the cure. Order is not mercy. Order is function. The phrase echoed one final time as the authority drafted a directive without precedent. A protocol that did not rewind, did not restrict, did not negotiate. It corrected. Directive X9 was not yet activated, but it was named, defined, waiting. As the Council adjourned, the Chronos arrays hummed louder than before, their rotations slightly off, their rhythms strained. Time was no longer merely bending, it was bracing. And somewhere within the anomaly, within the one who remembered, something shifted, as if the future itself had drawn a breath and decided not to exhale. The authority believed they were preserving causality. They did not yet realize they were about to challenge memory itself.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Directive X9 is issued. The decision did not arrive with alarms. There was no broadcast, no emergency signal rippling across the Chronos arrays, no public declaration etched into history feeds. The authority understood something fundamental about causality. The most powerful corrections happen quietly. Directive X9 was issued in silence. Within the Council's inner chamber, an architecture of suspended light and rotating temporal models, the final vote concluded without debate. Debate had already exhausted itself across 1,000 simulations. Every path that avoided decisive intervention collapsed into instability within 3 generations. So the directive was activated. If a life destabilizes the future, it is never allowed to finish. The phrase appeared first as a conditional statement in code, then as a line in procedural doctrine, then finally as a principle that replaced mercy altogether. The first erasure was small, intentionally so. A mid-level logistics coordinator in a coastal megacity. No criminal record, no public significance. But across multiple timelines, this individual consistently exploited micro-resets, adjusting trades, rerouting resources, nudging outcomes just enough to create cascading dependencies. Entire supply chains grew fragile around choices that were never meant to persist. In the corrected timeline, the coordinator was never born. No accident, no tragedy, no gap where a life should have been. Reality closed cleanly around the absence. Neighbors never noticed, records adjusted seamlessly. Memories rebalanced themselves like water finding a new level. The world continued, smoother than before. The authority observed the results. Stability increased. They authorized a second erasure, then a third. The process was elegant in its cruelty. Directive X9 did not remove people at the moment of failure, it removed them at the point of origin. Genetic threads unraveled, ancestral interactions subtly redirected. Entire lifetimes dissolved before they could introduce distortion. If a life destabilizes the future, it is never allowed to finish. The phrase echoed through the systems not as sound, but as logic. Those erased did not die. Death implies an ending. These lives were denied narrative altogether. No bodies, no funerals, no grief. only a faint pressure in the fabric of time, like a sentence rewritten before anyone could read it. At first, the authority restricted Directive X9 to extreme cases: high-frequency loop exploiters, temporal arbitrage specialists, individuals whose psychological profiles showed addiction to revision, people who could not tolerate irreversible outcomes. But the models demanded expansion. Each erasure improved causal coherence. Each correction reduced temporal noise. The future stabilized not because it was guided, but because it was simplified. If a life destabilizes the future, it is never allowed to finish. Across the world, subtle effects began to surface. A classroom with one fewer desk, a research paper citing an author who never existed, the reference dissolving mid-sentence, a family portrait that always felt slightly misaligned, as if someone had stepped out of frame long ago. Most people dismissed the sensation. Some could not. In the lower cognitive strata, those exposed to frequent resets but denied access to full memory wipes, unease accumulated. Dreams repeated without context. Faces appeared without names. A recurring sense of loss without object. And somewhere within the Chronos system, the anomaly reacted. The observer felt the first erasure like a cold incision across thought. Not pain, clarity. A sudden absence where a presence had been moments before. The memory remained, but the world insisted it never had been formed. The observer tested reality cautiously, cross-referencing timelines, anchoring recollections against physical markers. The result was unmistakable. Someone had been removed. If a life destabilizes the future, it is never allowed to finish. The phrase surfaced unbidden in the observer's mind, as if implanted or remembered from somewhere outside time. Each new erasure sharpened perception rather than dulling it. Where others smoothed over contradictions, the observer felt them deepen. The authority noticed. They adjusted parameters, increasing the aggressiveness of memory suppression algorithms. Neural dampener embedded in the reset wave intensified, scrubbing recollection more thoroughly with each cycle. Everyone forgot faster. Everyone except one. Directive X9 accelerated. Erased lives grew more complex. Artists, engineers, parents, people whose only crime was adaptability, those who learned too quickly how to bend time in their favor. The authority justified each deletion with the same unyielding logic. If a life destabilizes the future, it is never allowed to finish. Yet a paradox emerged. The more lives were erased, the more the observer remembered. Not just individuals, but entire timelines, failed futures, abandoned possibilities, worlds that no longer had permission to exist. Memory became an archive no system had authorized. Within the council, unease surfaced for the first time since the directive's activation. Not doubt in the policy, but concern over leakage, over residue. Memory, it seemed, was becoming contagious. As Directive X9 prepared to escalate from surgical correction to widespread pruning, the Chronos arrays emitted a new sound, low, sustained, almost like resistance. Time was not breaking, it was pushing back. The chapter closes as the authority authorizes the next phase of erasures, larger, faster, less discriminating. And the observer, standing alone in a world that insists nothing has changed, understands something the authority does not yet see. If erased lives are never allowed to finish, then unfinished memories might be the most dangerous force left in the future.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The Observer Who Remembers Everything. The authority never gave the anomaly a name. Names implied identity. Identity implied continuity, and continuity was precisely what the system was designed to erase. So the files labeled it simply Observer. The observer lived an ordinary life by every external measure, a mid-tier analyst in a city whose skyline shifted subtly from one reset to the next, no access to the Chronos arrays, no clearance, no visible importance, a life statistically insignificant. Except it didn't reset properly. The first time the observer noticed, it came as a sensation rather than a thought, a lingering echo after a correction wave passed through the city. The air shimmered, light bending for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Others blinked and moved on. The observer froze. Something was missing. Not an object, not a person standing nearby, something larger, a path, a version of the day that should have followed but didn't. Memory returned like a bruise surfacing hours after impact, a conversation that no longer made sense, a warning delivered by someone no one remembered, a street that once led somewhere else. The observer tested it the only way possible, by writing things down. Dates, details, faces, sounds, the low thunder of the Chronos arrays during a reset, the way people's voices flattened slightly afterwards, as if emotion itself lagged behind causality. Each reset erased the notes. Each reset failed to erase the memory of writing them. To remember is to resist. The phrase arrived uninvited, settling into the observer's thoughts with unsettling familiarity. It felt less like a belief and more like a law, something remembered rather than learned. With each Directive X9 erasure, the burden grew heavier. Lives that never finished left impressions behind, like footprints without walkers. The observer began to recognize patterns, empty spaces where people should have been, jobs that felt inherited, relationships that started already fractured. The observer remembered a sister who never existed. The grief was sharp, irrational, impossible to justify. No photos, no records, no corroboration, yet the memory persisted with intimate clarity. The sound of laughter during a storm, the shared silence before sleep. To remember is to resist. Sleep became dangerous. Dreams stitched together fragments from incompatible timelines. Cities drowned and burned and froze, then stood pristine again the next morning. Faces dissolved mid-sentence, names unraveled. The observer awoke exhausted, carrying emotional weight with no recognized source. The authority noticed the deviation. Sensors embedded throughout the population flagged cognitive irregularities. Most anomalies resolved themselves after successive resets, neural plasticity eventually surrendering to enforced coherence. This one did not. The observer's memory was not photographic, it was structural. Experiences layered rather than replaced. Each erased timeline added depth instead of confusion. A dangerous adaptation. To remember is to resist. The authority debated intervention. Memory suppression could be intensified. The observer could be erased retroactively, folded into Directive X9 itself. But curiosity stayed their hand. Because if one mind could retain continuity across corrections, then memory might be the missing variable in stabilizing time, or the catalyst that would shatter it. The observer began to listen differently. The city spoke in rhythms now, the pulse of energy conduits beneath streets, the subsonic resonance of distant machinery. The Chronos arrays sang if one knew how to hear them, a slow, mournful oscillation, strained and uneven. Reality was tired. In a market square one afternoon, the observer watched a child pause mid-step, eyes unfocused, as a micro-reset rippled outward. For half a second, the child looked directly at the observer, not with recognition, but with shared confusion. Then the moment passed. The child forgot. The observer did not. To remember is to resist. Guilt followed. Every remembered life felt like a stolen burden. If erasure was meant to protect the future, what did it mean to carry ghosts forward? Was memory itself destabilizing causality? Or was forgetting the real crime? The observer searched for others like them. Subtle tests, offhand remarks about déjà vu, questions framed carefully, withdrawn instantly at the first sign of discomfort. Nothing. The authorities' systems were thorough. And yet, something else began to happen. The observer's presence altered outcomes, not dramatically, not immediately. Small deviations, choices that felt heavier, decisions that refused to slide into optimal paths. People hesitated around the observer, as if sensing consequence again. Time behaved differently nearby. The Chronos arrays registered micro-resistance during resets localized around the observer's coordinates, infinitesimal, but growing. To remember is to resist. The authority escalated monitoring, and somewhere deep within the observer's layered memories, a realization formed. Slow, terrifying, inevitable. They weren't remembering everything by accident. They were being prepared. The chapter closes with the observer standing beneath the night sky as the arrays hum overhead. Stars flicker, one vanishing briefly before returning. A timeline trying to assert itself. The observer whispers the phrase out loud for the first time, feeling its weight settle fully into purpose. To remember is to resist. And resistance, they now understand, may be the only thing time has left.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Survival loops create weak civilizations. The loops were never meant to be permanent. They were designed as scaffolding, temporary structures to stabilize humanity while it learned how to step forward without falling. But scaffolding, left in place too long, becomes a cage. The observer saw it everywhere now. Cities gleamed with effortless efficiency. Infrastructure healed itself. Supply lines never failed for long. Every catastrophe arrived already rehearsed. The world moved with the confidence of something that could not truly lose. And that was the problem. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. The phrase surfaced again as the observer walked through a plaza rebuilt for the third time in a week, though no one else remembered the previous two destructions. Stone felt too smooth underfoot, polished by timelines that no longer existed. The air smelled faintly of ozone and correction. Humanity had become excellent at surviving and terrible at becoming. In earlier eras, failure carved lessons deep into culture. Wars reshaped borders, collapses rewrote economics, tragedies forced adaptation. But now, failure barely lingered long enough to teach fear, let alone wisdom. When buildings fell, they were rewound. When systems broke, they were optimized. When people failed, they tried again, identical, unchanged, unscarred. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. The authorities' internal reports confirmed what the observer felt instinctively. Civilizations with high loop reliance showed decreased innovation over time. Artistic movements stalled. Scientific breakthroughs plateaued. Moral frameworks thinned into procedural checklists. Why risk invention when the last version still worked? Why challenge belief when correction was always available? Entire generations grew up never seeing irreversible consequence. Children learned resilience as a theoretical concept, not a lived experience. Pain became abstract. Sacrifice became unnecessary. Comfort expanded. Character contracted. The observer watched a public address replayed across multiple timelines, a leader delivering the same speech with micro-adjustments each time, selecting the most compliant version of the crowd response before allowing the timeline to proceed. Democracy had become a rehearsal. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. The loops also changed how people related to each other. Relationships lost depth when endings were optional. Commitments weakened when mistakes could be undone. Apologies carried less weight when harm could be rewound. Love became careful. Courage became inefficient. The observer remembered friendships that had once ended painfully, necessary endings that shaped who they became. In this world, such endings rarely stuck, Arguments rewound, betrayals erased, growth postponed indefinitely. The authority justified it all with numbers. Stability indices rose, casualty rates dropped, happiness metrics improved. But the observer saw what the metrics could not measure: fragility. Civilizations optimized for survival alone became brittle. Remove the loops, and they shattered. Strip away correction, and there was nothing underneath. No practiced resilience, no cultural muscle memory for adversity. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. In the lower districts, where loop access was delayed or rationed, a different humanity emerged. People there still failed, still lost, still adapted the hard way. Their cities were rougher, their lives shorter, but their cultures moved. Music evolved, language shifted, innovations sparked from necessity rather than convenience. The observer felt more real there, as if time flowed thicker, heavier. The authority noticed this too, and classified it as inefficiency. To the authority, resilience without optimization was wasteful. Pain without correction was unacceptable. They believed humanity deserved protection from itself, but protection had become pacification. The observer felt the pull of loops constantly now, a gentle pressure inviting correction, smoothing edges, erasing discomfort. It would be so easy to surrender, to allow memory to soften, to let the past dissolve like it did for everyone else. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. The phrase became a shield. When a minor disaster struck, a transit failure cascading into chaos, the observer resisted the instinct to wait for the rewind. They acted, improvised, accepted the possibility that this version of events might stick. Others followed. Not many, but enough. The authority flagged the incident as anomalous, a localized spike in non-optimized behavior. People chose solutions that carried cost rather than waiting for correction. Time responded. The Chronos arrays hesitated before initiating a reset, a fraction of a second longer than normal. Choice had weight again. The observer realized then what the authority feared most. Survival loops didn't just weaken civilizations, they taught time that humanity no longer deserved forward motion. A future earned once is stronger than a future stolen repeatedly. As the chapter closes, the observer stands amid the aftermath of the unrest. Wounded people being treated, broken systems being repaired manually. It is messy, inefficient, painful, and alive. Above, the arrays hum uneasily, struggling to decide whether to correct what it sees. The observer looks up, understanding now that the greatest threat to the future is not catastrophe, but comfort. And if the loops ever fail completely, humanity will face the one test it has avoided for generations: who it becomes without a second chance.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6: When the Future Refuses to Exist. The first sign was silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation, the subtle, unnerving sense that tomorrow was no longer assembling itself. For centuries, probability fields had stretched forward like invisible scaffolding, allowing physicists to model futures, governments to plan decades ahead, and the Chronos arrays to anchor corrections to something stable. Then the models went blank. At first, the authority assumed error, sensor drift, computational lag, a misalignment caused by escalating Directive X9 activity. Engineers recalibrated instruments. Scientists reran simulations from archived baselines. The results did not change. Beyond a certain point, there were no futures to calculate. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. The phrase surfaced in the observer's mind as they studied the anomaly maps, dense clusters of collapsed probabilities spreading outward like frost across glass. Entire timelines no longer branched, they simply ended. Not in catastrophe, not in extinction, but in absence. Nothing followed. In the cities, people began to feel it without understanding why. Plans felt hollow, long-term promises rang false. The future tense itself weakened in language. Next year sounded speculative. Someday felt dishonest. Children stopped asking what they would become. The Chronos rays responded erratically. Their rotations slowed, then surged, as if searching for something to lock onto. Each reset required more energy, delivered less coherence. Time corrections that once snapped cleanly now smeared, leaving artifacts, ghost images, overlapping moments, brief lapses where two versions of reality tried to occupy the same space. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. The Authority convened an emergency session. Their simulations confirmed the impossible. Time was no longer accepting corrections as valid input. The loops, once tools of stability, had become noise. Probability refused to converge. Cause and effect no longer trusted each other. Time was withdrawing cooperation. For the first time since the Chronos arrays were activated, the Authority faced a system that could not be optimized by force. The observer felt the change more intimately. Where memory once layered itself neatly, now it frayed. Some memoried futures no longer aligned with any present trajectory. Others sensed impending events that never arrived. The observer stood on a transit platform watching arrivals flicker in and out. Vehicles scheduled, then unscheduled, then absent entirely. People waited anyway, driven by habit rather than certainty. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. The Authority traced the collapse back to a single accelerating factor: excessive erasure. Directive X9 had removed too many variables too quickly. Lives that would have absorbed instability had been deleted. Decisions that would have forced adaptation were never allowed to complete. The system had become over-pruned. In nature, ecosystems collapse when diversity vanishes. In time, the same rule applied. By simplifying causality too aggressively, the Authority had removed the buffers that allowed futures to form at all. Time was no longer willing to project forward on behalf of the civilization that refused consequence. The observer realized something else, something the Authority had not yet named. The future was not failing, it was refusing. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. Negotiation required terms, boundaries, trust. Humanity had violated all three. Every reset had been a demand, not a dialogue. Every erasure a declaration that outcome mattered more than process. Time had complied until compliance itself became destabilizing. Now it was pushing back. Across the world, small enclaves began to experience something unprecedented, uncorrected continuity. Localized regions where the Chronos arrays simply did nothing. Disasters unfolded without rewind. Choices stuck. Consequences accumulated. People panicked, then adapted. The observer traveled to one such zone, a coastal district abandoned by correction waves. Buildings bore scars. Infrastructure was uneven. Life expectancy dropped. So did dependence. People there planned carefully, loved fiercely, chose slowly. They understood instinctively that nothing would be undone. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. In these zones, probability began to return, not smooth, not optimized, but present. Fragile futures assembled themselves cautiously, like tentative agreements. The Authority watched in horror and fascination. Stability was emerging not from control, but from restraint. Yet outside these zones, collapse accelerated. Regions still reliant on loops found themselves unable to project even days ahead. Markets froze. Governments delayed decisions indefinitely. Culture stagnated in anticipation of a future that refused to arrive. The observer understood the paradox clearly now. Time was willing to move forward, but only with those who accepted irreversibility. The Authority prepared a final escalation, a global reset, the most powerful reset ever attempted, one decisive act to force probability back into alignment. The observer knew what that would mean. If time rejected negotiation, it would reject force entirely. The future is not guaranteed, it is negotiated. As the chapter closes, the Kronos arrays begin to power up for the global reset. The sky glows faintly, vibrating with suppressed energy. Across the planet, people feel it, the coming correction that promises safety, comfort, erasure. In the uncorrected zones, no such glow appears. Time waits, and the observer stands between two paths, a future demanded and a future earned, knowing only one of them is willing to exist.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Authority versus Adaptation. The Authority had always trusted control. Control built the Kronos arrays. Control stabilized civilizations. Control erased disasters before they could scar history. Every success the Council pointed to shared the same foundation: intervention, correction, precision. Control preserved systems, but systems were no longer the only thing at stake. The observer stood at the edge of an uncorrected zone as the global reset charged overhead, feeling the tension between two philosophies strained the fabric of time itself. The Authority prepared to enforce stability. The future hesitated, waiting to see which logic would prevail. Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The phrase repeated in the observer's mind, not as defiance, but as diagnosis. Within the council chambers, simulations fractured. The global reset, designed to brute force probability back into alignment, showed temporary success followed by catastrophic rebound. Futures stabilized for days, then collapsed harder than before. Each attempt required more energy, more erasure, more suppression. Control was losing efficiency. The Authority refused to accept it. They believed adaptation was chaos by another name: unpredictable, inefficient, cruel. Allowing pain to persist was, to them, a moral failure. Humanity had earned mastery over time. Why surrender it now? Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The observer remembered the uncorrected districts, the scarred buildings, the cautious planning, the way people listened more carefully to one another. Those places were unstable, yes, but they were alive. Their futures were narrow but real. The Authority's futures were broad and empty. Control froze behavior. Optimization eliminated variation. The more tightly the system was managed, the fewer ways it could respond to novelty. Growth introduced instability, but also resilience. It forced systems to reorganize rather than repeat. The observer understood something the Council could not. Adaptation required trust. Trust in time. Trust in consequence. Trust that survival was not the only metric that mattered. Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The Council authorized limited experimentation. Adaptation zones expanded slightly. Correction delays introduced as a compromise. They framed it as data collection, not ideological shift. Time responded immediately. Probability density increased around those zones. Futures began to branch again, tentatively, cautiously, but undeniably. The Kronos arrays reported lower strain where intervention was withheld. Control, it seemed, was the stressor. The observer was summoned, not physically, never physically, but through subtle manipulation of access and coincidence. Doors unlocked when they shouldn't. Transit routes aligned. Information surfaced unencrypted. An invitation without acknowledgement. The observer entered a chamber that existed between moments, where the Authority's projections hovered like frozen storms. No faces appeared, only voices, layered, synchronized, precise. "You are a variable," the Authority said. "Variables destabilize systems." The observer listened. "You retain memory across corrections. You influence behavior. You encourage non-optimized outcomes. This is dangerous." Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The observer spoke calmly, knowing every word would echo across simulations. "You have mistaken survival for existence. You preserve systems that no longer support life." The Authority countered with data, casualty projections, collapse curves, the cost of uncorrected failure. The observer countered with something the Authority lacked: lived continuity, memory of erased worlds, the weight of choices denied. Life is not a system, it's a process. Silence followed, not because the authority was persuaded, but because the simulations had no response. Every model that allowed adaptation produced short-term instability and long-term coherence. Every model that enforced control produced diminishing returns. Control preserved the present. Adaptation preserved the future. Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The authority faced a dilemma they had engineered themselves into. To survive, they would need to relinquish control. To relinquish control would invalidate their mandate. The global reset hovered at full charge, a weapon against uncertainty. The observer felt time strain, like a held breath stretched too long. The future waited, unwilling to form until terms were agreed. In the uncorrected zones, people acted without instruction, prepared shelters, made plans that assumed permanence, chose leaders knowing they would have to live with the consequences. Time rewarded them with continuity. The authority made a final decision. They would not adapt. They would enforce. As the observer felt it immediately, the Chronos array is surging, the global reset initiating despite mounting resistance, control asserting itself one last time. Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. As the chapter closes, the observer stands at the threshold of the coming correction, understanding fully what it means. If the reset succeeds, the future will stabilize, but remain hollow. If it fails, control will collapse, and something untested will emerge. The observer does not know which outcome will occur, only that life has already chosen its side.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. The Cost of Remembering Too Much. The human mind was never designed to carry multiple lifetimes. The observer learned this not as theory, but as erosion. Memory did not arrive neatly labeled by timeline. It bled. It overlapped. It pressed inward from all directions, filling quiet moments with ghosts that had no permission to exist. Sleep became fragmented. Dreams were no longer symbolic. They were literal. Cities rebuilt and destroyed in the same night. Faces aged backward. Conversations ended before they began. The observer woke with tears already falling, grief arriving before consciousness could assign a cause. Pain teaches what loops erase. The phrase repeated like a pulse, steady and unforgiving. Each erased life left residue, not just memory, but weight. Emotional mass accumulated without release. The mind adapted by compressing it, folding entire timelines into sensations, dread when standing in certain streets, warmth when hearing a stranger's voice, panic at the sight of a doorway that once led to safety in a world that no longer existed. The observer began to lose track of which version of events belonged to this timeline, which losses were real now and which were real then. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. The authority noticed the deterioration. Biometric readings showed elevated neural activity far beyond sustainable thresholds. Memory consolidation never fully completed. Emotional regulation faltered. The observer's mind was behaving like a system denied rest, constantly recalculating, constantly bracing for correction that never came. They considered intervention. Memory suppression could be forced. The anomaly could be muted. The observer could be spared. They chose not to. Pain teaches what loops erase. The observer understood this more clearly with each unraveling thought. In the looped world, pain had been optional, rewound, softened, erased. Growth had been delayed indefinitely. Here, in the uncorrected mind, pain accumulated into understanding. The observer remembered a city that survived because it learned from a flood instead of erasing it, another that collapsed because it never did. Remembered lovers who grew apart because they had to, and others who stagnated because they never faced loss. Pain was not the enemy, avoidance was. Pain teaches what loops erase. The body began to fail next.
tremors in the hands, migraines triggered by temporal fluctuations others barely noticed. Sounds carried too much information, the hum of the Chronos arrays slicing directly into the nervous system, each oscillation echoing like a reminder of everything stolen. The observer isolated themselves, not out of fear, but necessity. Too many people carried unrecognized echoes. Too many conversations sparked memories that could not be shared without destabilizing others. Loneliness became another cost. The authority watched from afar, calculating trade-offs. The observer's suffering was undeniable, but so was the effect. Around them, people changed. They hesitated before asking for rewinds, accepted outcomes more readily, grieved fully. Memory was contagious. Pain teaches what loops erase. In moments of weakness, the observer wondered if forgetting would be kinder, if surrendering memory would ease the pressure, allow life to proceed unburdened. The loops offered that promise: softness, safety, sleep. But the observer had seen what forgetting created. Civilizations that repeated instead of learning, people who survived without becoming wiser, futures that collapsed because no one remembered how to endure. Pain hurt because it mattered. Pain teaches what loops erase. During one uncorrected night, the observer walked through a district scheduled for reset, one of the last places still under full authority control. The air vibrated with impending correction. People went about their routines calmly, trusting the rewind to fix whatever went wrong. The observer felt every version of the night that had already happened and every one that would be erased. A child laughed near a fountain that would shatter. A couple argued in words they would never remember saying. A man made a choice that in another timeline would have saved his life. They carried them all. When the reset wave hit, the world snapped back. Everyone forgot. Pain teaches what loops erase. They awoke hours later, uncertain which version of the day they were in. For a terrifying moment, memory fractured entirely, timelines slipping out of alignment, identity dissolving into narrative noise. Then something stabilized. The pain did not vanish, but it organized itself, like bone knitting after a break. The observer realized memory was not trying to destroy them, it was trying to reshape them. Evolution required pressure, growth required cost, time itself demanded witnesses willing to carry what others could not. The observer stood, unsteady but resolute, understanding the final truth of their role. They were not meant to survive intact, they were meant to remember enough to guide what came next. Pain teaches what loops erase. As the chapter closes, the authority prepares its final gambit, one last correction powerful enough to overwhelm even resistant memory. A mercy, they tell themselves, an end to suffering. The observer feels it coming, and for the first time they are not afraid of the pain to come, only of a future where no one remembers why it mattered.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Rewriting the Rewrite. The authority believed the final correction would end uncertainty. They called it a mercy cycle, a reset so comprehensive it would drown resistance, overwrite memory, and lock probability into a stable configuration for generations. Pain would be erased. Choice would be softened. Time would obey again. The observer knew better. The future could not be forced into existence. It had to be allowed to survive. A future that survives failure is the only real future. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It emerged slowly, painfully, assembled from the weight of remembered worlds. Every erased timeline had taught the same lesson from a different angle. When failure was denied completion, it returned distorted, magnified, unresolved. Failure unfinished was instability. Failure completed was instruction. The observer acted not by confronting the authority directly, but by doing what they had always done best: remembering. They mapped the corrections backward, tracing where timelines were cut short, where consequences were interrupted. They searched for a path not optimized, not corrected, but allowed. The paradox was simple and terrifying. A timeline where the authority chose not to intervene. No rewinds, no erasures, no mercy cycles. A timeline where humanity failed and lived with it. A future that survives failure is the only real future. The observer seeded the paradox quietly, embedding it into the Chronos array's own logic, not as a command, but as a question the system could not ignore. What happens if correction is withheld entirely? Time responded immediately. The arrays hesitated, not from resistance, but from confusion. They were designed to act, not abstain, to correct, not observe. For the first time since their creation, they encountered a scenario with no optimization target. The authority noticed the anomaly too late. In a single uncorrected region, small, isolated, written off as statistically insignificant, the paradox took hold. A failure occurred. Infrastructure collapsed. Lives were lost. Systems broke beyond repair. And nothing rewound. People panicked. Then they mourned. Then they rebuilt. Differently. A future that survives failure is the only real future. The authority watched the region closely, expecting collapse. Instead, something unfamiliar emerged. Accountability. Leaders stepped down, communities reorganized, designs changed to prevent recurrence rather than relying on correction. Pain was not erased, it was transformed. The observer felt the shift like a deep breath finally released. Probability stabilized around a region, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. Time trusted it. The authority attempted intervention. Localized resets failed. The paradox resisted correction, not through force, but through coherence. The timeline made sense. Cause followed effect. Consequence followed choice. Time preferred it. A future that survives failure is the only real future. Across the world, similar failures unfolded as the authorities' control weakened. Systems accustomed to rewinds faltered. Markets crashed. Cities struggled. Governments hesitated without the safety net of correction. For a moment, it looked like collapse. Then something else happened. People adapted. Not all survived. Not all succeeded. But those who did changed. They learned to plan with permanence in mind, to weigh decisions carefully, to value resilience over efficiency. The observer moved among them quietly, a witness rather than a leader. Their memory stabilized now, no longer fracturing under impossible load. Pain remained, but it had purpose. The authority faced a choice they could no longer delay. Enforce the final correction and risk total temporal collapse, or allow the paradox to spread. Control preserves systems. Adaptation preserves life. The council fractured. Some clung to doctrine. Others saw the data no longer aligned with belief. Futures stabilized where correction was absent, collapsed where control persisted. The conclusion was unavoidable. The rewrite had to be rewritten. A future that survives failure is the only real future. The authority powered down the Chronos arrays, not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. Correction waves weakened, rewinds slowed, erasures halted mid-process. Time surged forward, uneven and dangerous, but alive. The observer stood beneath a sky no longer vibrating with imminent reset. Stars held steady. Tomorrow felt uncertain again, and real. The paradox had taken root. As the chapter closes, the authority issues a final transmission, brief, unprecedented, unrecorded by any official archive. Correction suspended, consequence restored. The observer knows this is not an ending. It is the beginning of something far harder. A world without rewinds, a future that must be earned only once. and humanity at last standing alone with its choices, without permission to undo them.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Choosing a Single Timeline. The world did not end when the Authority dissolved. It simply stopped hesitating. There was no announcement declaring the end of temporal governance, no ceremonial shutdown of the Chronos arrays, no final speech explaining what had been lost or gained. The Authority understood, at last, that legitimacy could not survive in a future that demanded commitment over correction. So they faded. Control nodes went dark one by one. Intervention protocols timed out and were never renewed. The arrays still existed, vast rings of dormant potential humming softly in orbit, but they no longer spoke with authority. They observed. They waited. Time stabilized, not because it was constrained, but because it was finally allowed to move forward without interruption. You only become real when there is no reset. The phrase surfaced everywhere, independently, as if remembered rather than invented. It appeared in journals, in speeches, in quiet conversations held long into uncertain nights. A truth people felt before they could explain it. The observer watched cities change, not quickly, not cleanly, but honestly. Infrastructure was rebuilt with permanence in mind. Systems were designed to fail safely, not rewind magically. Laws were written knowing mistakes would endure. Decision-making slowed and deepened. Without correction, people chose more carefully. Promises gained weight. Words mattered again. Apologies carried consequence. Love demanded courage. You only become real when there is no reset. Some mourn the loss of safety. The loops had been a kind of cradle, protecting humanity from the sharpest edges of existence. Without them, life hurt more. Loss lingered. Death was final. But meaning returned with it. The observer felt their memory settle for the first time since the anomaly began. The weight remained, but it no longer crushed. The erased timelines faded into something like ancestry, informing rather than overwhelming. They were no longer alone in remembering. Humanity remembered differently now, not erased lives, but lessons. Cultures recorded failure openly. Children were taught not just what succeeded, but what had broken and why. Time, unburdened, flowed more slowly, or perhaps perception had changed. Days felt fuller. Years felt earned. The Authority's final act was not correction, but abdication. Their archives were unlocked, their doctrines released into public memory. History absorbed them without reverence or hatred. They became a lesson. Control had preserved a version of humanity. Commitment allowed it to grow. You only become real when there is no reset. The observer visited the Chronos arrays one last time. Not physically, few could, but through the resonance they had learned to feel. The machines were quiet now, their hum a low, steady background note rather than a command. Time no longer flinched around them. The observer understood then that their role was complete, not as a guardian, not as a leader, but as a bridge between what had been erased and what had been chosen. They had carried memory so others could carry responsibility. That was enough. In a coastal city rebuilt after an uncorrected storm, the observer watched people gather for a memorial. Names were spoken aloud, not just of the dead, but of the decisions that led there. Mistakes acknowledged without shame, futures planned without guarantees. A child asked a simple question: what happens if we choose wrong? An adult answered honestly: then we learn, and we live with it. You only become real when there is no reset. As the chapter and the story draws to a close, the sky above the city remains steady. No glow of imminent correction, no vibration of rewinding reality. Just stars, fixed and distant, watching a species finally willing to commit to its own timeline. Time does not intervene. It observes. And humanity, standing on a single irreversible path at last, takes its next step forward, not because it can undo the past, but because it has chosen to live with it. No reset is coming. And for the first time, that is enough.
Time does not reward hesitation. It does not respect repetition. It does not preserve those who refuse consequence. Directive X9 was never about erasing people. It was about erasing dependency on rewinds, excuses, and second versions of the same failed self. The observer proved one truth across every deleted future. Growth requires finality. You do not need more time. You need fewer resets. You need decisions that cannot be undone. So choose your timeline. Choose the version of yourself that moves forward without guarantees, because the future does not wait for permission, and it will overwrite you if you refuse to evolve. No reset is coming. Act accordingly.